3 years ago, a young doctor looked at my chart, looked at my age, and then looked back at me with the kind of face people make when they think something must be wrong. He said, "Mrs. Thompson, you're telling me you still drive yourself here?" I told him yes. He asked, "And you still read without glasses most of the time?" Yes again. Then he paused and asked the question I've been hearing more and more lately. "How is your memory?" I looked at him and said, "Young man, I remember the smell of the chalk in my third-grade classroom in 1929. I remember the name of the boy who sat behind me and pulled my braids. I remember the first time I tasted blueberries straight from my grandmother's garden when I was 6 years old." Then I leaned forward and asked him something back. "Tell me, how old are you?" He smiled and said, 40. I nodded slowly. "Well," I said, "my brain feels about your age. Now listen to me carefully. I am 103 years old. I still know what day it is. I still know where I put my house keys. I still finish the crossword puzzle in the morning paper before my tea gets cold. And most importantly, I still remember the people I love. But the strange thing is this. For most of my life, doctors kept warning me that one day my mind would disappear. They told me it runs in families. They told me age takes it away. They told me there's not much anyone can do. I believed them for a while. Until I started watching what happened to people around me. Good people. Smart people. People who used to run businesses and teach classrooms and raise families. And then one day, they began forgetting things. First it was little things. A name here. A date there. Then it became something much heavier. I once visited a friend of mine, Betty, in a nursing home. We had been neighbors for 40 years. Our children grew up together. We baked pies together every Thanksgiving. When I walked into her room that afternoon, she looked right at me, smiled politely, and said, "Hello dear, have we met before?" I drove home that day with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. Because something inside me realized a very frightening truth. If it happened to Betty, it could happen to me. And that night, sitting at my kitchen table at 72 years old, I made a decision that quietly changed the rest of my life. I told myself something very simple. I would fight for my mind. Every single day. But before I tell you the strange things I started doing after that night, let me ask you something. How old are you right now? Tell me in the comments, and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel around the world. And if you enjoy listening to the thoughts of an old woman who has lived a very long time, go ahead and subscribe so we can keep sharing these little pieces of life together. Now, the reason I decided to fight for my mind started with something a doctor told me in 1991. And I still remember every word of that conversation. Because according to him, my brain wasn't supposed to last this long. And what happened after that appointment is something that still makes me smile today. The year was 1991. That moment, I was sitting in a small examination room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and paper gowns. The kind of room where the clock ticks loudly and every minute feels longer than it should. Across from me sat a neurologist named Dr. Harrison Cole. Serious man. Thin glasses. The sort who spoke slowly, like every word had to pass through 3 layers of caution before it came out. He had been studying my family history. My father. My aunt. My older sister. All 3 of them had lost their memory before they turned 80. Dr. Cole closed the folder on his desk and looked at me with a face that tried to be kind. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, "based on your family history, there is a strong chance your cognitive health could decline in the coming decades." Now that is a very polite way of saying something frightening. He continued explaining. Words like degeneration. Words like risk factors. Words like prepare yourself. Then he slid a stack of glossy pamphlets across the desk. On the cover were smiling older couples walking on beaches. Inside were long explanations about memory loss, brain decline, and how families should prepare for the possibility. I remember picking up one of those pamphlets and flipping through it slowly. And something about it bothered me. Not the science. Not the statistics. What bothered me was the feeling that it was already decided. As if my story had already been written. As if one day I would simply wake up and my memories would begin quietly disappearing. I put the pamphlet down and asked him a question. "Doctor," I said, "is there anything a person can do?" He hesitated for a moment. Then he gave me the kind of answer doctors often give when they don't want to promise too much. "Well, maintaining general health is helpful. But genetics do play a significant role." Genetics. In other words, luck. I thanked him politely, walked out of the clinic, got into my car, and drove home in complete silence. But I remember something very clearly about that drive. I didn't feel defeated. I felt angry. Not the loud kind of anger. The quiet kind. The kind that sits in your chest and says, "We'll see about that." Because here's the thing people don't realize about growing old. When you've lived long enough, you begin to notice patterns. You watch people carefully. You notice what helps them. And you notice what slowly destroys them. And over the next 20 years, I watched something happen again and again. Friends who were only a little older than me began slipping away. At first it looked like small forgetfulness. But it didn't stop there. One neighbor forgot how to balance his checkbook. Another began getting lost driving home from the grocery store. And then one day, my sister Margaret forgot my name. We had shared a bedroom for 18 years growing up. And yet she looked at me like I was a stranger standing in her kitchen. That was the moment something inside me locked into place. Because I started asking myself a question that no one else seemed to be asking. What if the brain works more like a garden than a machine? What if the way we live every day quietly shapes whether our minds grow stronger, or slowly wither away? That question changed everything for me. Because from that moment forward, I started paying attention to every single habit in my life. What I ate. How I slept. How I used my mind. Even how I handled anger. And over time I noticed something fascinating. The people who kept their minds the longest were doing a handful of very simple things that most people ignored. Things so ordinary that doctors almost never talk about them. The first one started with something sitting in my frying pan every single morning. And it's a food many people stopped eating because someone once told them it was dangerous. But I've eaten it almost every day for more than 60 years. And if you walked into my kitchen tomorrow morning, you would see exactly what I mean. If you walked into my kitchen tomorrow morning, the first thing you would smell is butter warming in a small cast iron pan. Not vegetable oil. Not margarine. Real butter. And sitting on the counter beside the stove would be 3 brown eggs. I have eaten 3 eggs almost every morning of my adult life. Now I know what some of you are already thinking. For years people said eggs were terrible for you. Too much cholesterol. Too much fat. Doctors warned people to avoid them. I remember hearing those warnings back in the 1970s. Friends stopped eating eggs almost overnight. They switched to dry cereal and toast because they believed that was the healthy choice. But something about that advice never made sense to me. My grandmother raised chickens on a little piece of land outside town. When I was a girl, eggs were one of the most common foods on our table. And my grandmother lived to be 97 with a mind sharp as a tack. So I kept eating them. And over the years, scientists slowly began discovering something fascinating about eggs. Inside that golden yolk is a nutrient called choline. Your brain uses choline to build something called acetylcholine. And acetylcholine is one of the chemicals your brain uses to store and retrieve memories. In simple terms, It helps your brain remember things. Now I didn't know the fancy scientific names back then. All I knew was that every time I started my day with a proper breakfast, my mind felt clearer, stronger, ready. And here is something else I noticed. People who skipped breakfast often complained about feeling foggy in the morning, slow, forgetful. Meanwhile, I would finish my eggs, wash my plate, sit down with the newspaper, and finish the crossword puzzle before most people had even finished their coffee. But eggs were only the beginning. Because there was another food I started eating regularly after that appointment with Dr. Cole in 1991. A food that smells like the ocean. A food many people avoid because they say it's too fishy. But this one habit turned out to be one of the most powerful things I ever did for my brain. Fatty fish. Salmon. Sardines. Mackerel. The oily kinds. I began eating them 3 or 4 times every week. And over time I learned something remarkable about the human brain. Nearly 60% of your brain is made of fat. Not sugar. Not protein. Fat. Which means the kind of fat you feed your body eventually becomes part of the structure of your brain itself. The omega-3 fats found in fish, DHA and EPA, help build strong, flexible connections between brain cells. Think of them like oil in the engine of your mind. Without enough of it, things start grinding. Inflammation begins. Signals slow down. Memories slip. And here is something else I quietly refused to do. I never cooked with the shiny bottles of vegetable oil that started filling grocery store shelves decades ago. Corn oil. Soybean oil. Canola oil. Everyone around me switched to them. But I kept cooking the way my grandmother did. Butter. Sometimes a little lard. Simple, real fats. Nothing from a factory. And now here I am at 103 years old. Still remembering the names of my childhood neighbors. Still recalling songs I learned in school before World War II even began. Of course, food is only part of the story. Because if food is the fuel for your brain, there is something else that acts like the exercise. And most people stop doing it completely the moment they retire. That mistake slowly steals more memories than people realize. And I almost fell into that trap myself. Until something unexpected happened the first year after I stopped teaching.